I want to start with the morning because the morning is the part this town has spent 25 years trying not to remember, and it's the part I can't forget if I tried. It was July, before light, and the police came through the part of town where I've lived my whole life, and they went house to house, and they took people out of their beds, took them out in whatever they'd been sleeping in. There was a man they hauled off in his boxer shorts because they told him where he was going. He wouldn't need clothes. By the time the sun came up over the panhandle, they had arrested around 46 people in a town of 5,000, and nearly all of them were black, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that the black people in Tulia were maybe a few hundred souls all told. So what they took that morning was something like a tenth of us, a tenth of an entire people in one sweep before breakfast. They charged them all with dealing cocaine. And here is the thing I need you to hold on to through this whole story, because everything turns on it. There was no evidence, none. No drugs were found in those houses that morning. There were no photographs, there were no recordings, no video, no audio, not 1 second of it. There were no other witnesses, not a single other officer who'd seen any of it happen. There was one thing, and one thing only, holding up every one of those arrests. The word of one man, one white stranger who'd been in our town about 18 months, who claimed he'd been buying drugs from us all that time, and who kept his notes. I am not making this up, written on his own leg. The word of that one man was enough to take a tenth of us. And the part that still keeps me up, the part that's harder than the morning itself, the town believed him. My town. The good people of Tulia. The ones who'd known these defendants their whole lives, who'd coached them in Little League, and sat behind them in church, and sold them groceries when one stranger with a badge said your neighbors are all dealers. The town said, well, all right then, and it locked them up, some of them for 90 years. So let me tell you how a thing like that happens. Because it didn't happen because Tulia was a town full of monsters. I've lived here my whole life, and I'll tell you, plain it isn't. It happened for a reason that's much more ordinary and much more frightening, and I'm afraid it could happen in your town too. Tulia sits up in the Texas Panhandle flat country, farm country, where the land runs out to the edge of the sky in every direction, and the biggest thing for miles is the grain elevator. A few thousand people, county seat of Swisher County. The kind of place that was poor and getting poorer, no money in it. The young people leaving for the cities, the farms struggling, mostly white. There was a small black community, the way a lot of these little Texas towns have down on one end, going back generations, and we had our churches and our families and our place. And for the most part, the town worked the way these towns work, everybody knowing everybody, which is a comfort and a cage at the same time. And in the years I'm talking about, there was a thing going on all over the country that you have to understand to make sense of what happened here. The war on drugs. And it wasn't just a slogan. It came with money. The federal government was sending money down to little places like ours to set up special drug task forces, and here's the wrinkle that did us in. The money kept coming based on how many arrests you made. The more people you busted, the more grant money your task force got the next year. You see what that does? It turns arrests into a crop. It gives a poor county a reason to want drug dealers to need them, almost because dealers on paper are dollars. So our county joined up with one of these regional task forces, and the task force needed somebody to go undercover in Tulia to root out the drug trade that the thinking went must be there the way it was everywhere on the television. And the man they sent us was named Tom Coleman. I've had a long time to think about Tom Coleman, and I've landed somewhere that surprises people. I don't think Tom Coleman is the most important person in this story. He's the obvious villain, and he earned every bit of that. But I think focusing on him lets the rest of us off the hook, and the rest of us don't deserve to be let off the hook. But you have to know who he was. He came from law enforcement. His daddy had been a Texas Ranger, a famous one, and that name opened doors for the son that the son could never have opened himself, because the son was a mess. He'd worked a string of police jobs and left them under a cloud, the kind of leaving where you quit before they can fire you. He was deep in debt. While he was right here in Tulia supposedly working undercover for us, there was a warrant out for him in another county for theft for stealing gas with a county card. And there were people who'd heard him use the ugliest words there are for black people. Heard him say them right out loud in front of other officers, and nobody did a thing about it. That was the man whose word took a tenth of us, and the people in charge, the sheriff, the prosecutor, some of what I just told you they knew. They knew about the warrant, and they kept it quiet, and they put him on the stand anyway. For 18 months he claimed to be making buy after buy, more than 100 of them. And there were tells if anybody had wanted to see them. Every single buy he claimed was powder cocaine, the expensive kind. But the few folks in Tulia who did mess with drugs couldn't have afforded powder. It was crack down here if it was anything, because crack was cheap. 100-some powder cocaine deals in a dirt-poor panhandle town. Somebody should have stopped right there and asked the simplest question in the world. The question one woman in town asked when she read the headline, 46 dealers in Tulia. Selling to who? Who exactly was buying all this cocaine in a town too? Broke to keep a single fast food restaurant open. Nobody asked, because nobody wanted to. The morning of the sweep, the local paper ran it like a triumph. Like Tulia had finally done something, finally landed on the map. There were the faces of the arrested lined up, the way you'd run a county fair winner. The story was that we'd cleaned house, that the rot had been cut out, and not long after the state of Texas named Tom Coleman its outstanding lawman of the year, and there's a photograph of him shaking hands being honored, smiling by the Attorney General of Texas himself, a man who'd later go on to the United States Senate. The whole machine, top to bottom, blessing it. And then came the trials, and the trials are where the ordinary horror of this really lives, because the trials weren't a riot or a lynch mob. They were quiet. They were polite. They were the system working exactly the way it was built to work, and that's so much worse. Most of the defendants were too poor to make bail, so they sat in jail waiting. They got lawyers appointed to them, and a lot of those lawyers did next to nothing, no real investigation, quick work, get it over with. And the juries they faced were just about all white. And here is the cruelty at the center of it: those defendants got offered deals. Plead guilty, the prosecutor would say, and we'll give you 10 years. Fight it, and if the jury believes Coleman, and the jury always believed Coleman, you could get 90. Imagine being innocent and having to do that arithmetic. Imagine knowing you did nothing, and knowing it doesn't matter, and having to choose between 10 years for a lie and 90 years for the truth. A lot of people took the 10. Wouldn't you? You'd tell yourself anything to not lose your whole life. So they stood up in court and said guilty to things they never did, just to save what years they could. And every one of those guilty pleas got written down as proof the bust was righteous. The ones who wouldn't bend got buried for it. There was a man named Joe Moore, a hog farmer. Older fellow raised hogs out at the edge of things. He was the first to go to trial. No drugs ever, found nothing but Coleman's word, and they gave Joe Moore 90 years. 90. For a man his age, that's a death sentence, and everybody in that courtroom knew it. There was a young man, Freddie Brookins Jr., barely in his 20s, and he would not plead guilty to a thing he didn't do. He insisted on his trial, and the jury that convicted him and sent him away for 20 years, that jury had his own coaches on it. The men who'd coached him in youth basketball in Little League, men who had known that boy since he was small enough to need help with his glove. They knew him, and they took the word of a stranger over the boy they'd coached. That's the detail I'd give you if I could give you only one. Not because those jurors were evil, because they weren't. They were regular Tulia men who could not let themselves believe that the badge would lie to them, and so they made themselves believe that the boy they'd known his whole life was a drug dealer instead. That's the trade the human mind will make to keep its faith in authority. It will sacrifice the neighbor it can see to protect the system it can't. The sentences ran up into the hundreds of years across all the cases. The prosecutor went after them hard, went hardest. Some said at the ones with clean records and decent families, the ones who looked most like they had something to lose. The only people he let go were the ones with alibis so airtight even he couldn't get around them. There was a woman, Tanya White, who Coleman swore had sold him cocaine in Tulia on a certain morning at a certain hour, and she had a bank record proving she'd been in Oklahoma City that very morning, signing for a withdrawal hours away. Her case got dropped. But by then her own brothers and sister had already been sentenced, the three of them, to something near 100 years between them. Same family. The lie just happened to have a hole in it for her, and not for them. And there was a man Coleman described in his report as tall, with a big bushy head of hair. The man they arrested on that description was short, and had been bald for years. Didn't match a word of it. Didn't matter until somebody finally made it matter. That's how it sat for years. The convicted went off to prison. The town moved on, told itself the story of the great Tulia bust, and the families left behind, my neighbors. My people lived with the holes where their sons and husbands and daughters used to be. And the rest of the town, the comfortable part, did the thing towns do best with an injustice they half suspect. It looked away. It let the quiet settle back over everything, the same quiet that let it happen. But it didn't hold. And I want to be honest about why it didn't hold, because the truth of it is humbling for a town like mine. It didn't hold because of a few people who would not let go, and almost none of them were the powerful ones, and most of the ones who finally cracked it open weren't even from here. There was a preacher, a white man, who looked at what had happened and couldn't square it with his conscience, and he started a little group to fight it. Just a handful of people at first, holding meetings, making noise nobody wanted to hear. There was a journalist who dug into Tom Coleman's past and laid it all out. The warrant, the firings, the lies, the leg notes in a long piece that got read far beyond Texas. There was a stubborn lawyer up in Amarillo who took the cases nobody else would touch and kept at them for years for almost nothing. And then the story traveled the way a true thing sometimes finally does, and it reached a young lawyer back east, fresh out of law school at the ACP Legal Defense Fund, a woman named Vanita Gupta. And she came down here to the Panhandle and looked at the size of it, and didn't flinch. She started the long grinding legal work of trying to free all of them at once. And she went to the big fancy law firms and told them the civil rights movement had a new front line, and it ran right through Tulia, Texas, and to their credit some of them came. And in 2003 they finally got a real hearing in front of a judge brought in from Dallas, and they put Tom Coleman on the stand, and this time there were real lawyers in the room who knew how to take a liar apart. And they took him apart. Everything he'd built his cases on came undone in the open in front of everyone, the whole rotten structure of it. The state could not hold it together anymore. The convictions got thrown out. That summer the defendants who were still locked up walked free, and in August the governor of Texas pardoned 35 of them. Tom Coleman was put on trial himself for perjury for lying under oath, and he was convicted of it. Though I'll tell you how that ended because the ending matters. The man who helped send Joe Moore away for 90 years got probation. No prison. The town that the task force operated under paid out a settlement, several $1 million, split among the people whose lives it had stolen, and a third of that went to the lawyers the way it does. The task force itself was shut down, and the state of Texas passed a law that you couldn't do this anymore, that you couldn't convict a person on the bare word of one undercover officer with nothing to back it up. They had to learn that. They had to pass a law to make themselves promise not to do again the thing they'd just done to us. So you could call it justice. The records were cleared. The people came home. The system very slowly admitted it had been wrong, and in the histories that's how it gets written. A story of injustice turned into justice, the system correcting itself in the end. But I lived here, and I'm telling you, it doesn't feel like a story with a happy ending. It feels like a story about how much it costs to undo even one morning's worth of harm, and how the cost never gets paid back, not really. Because what did they come home to? Joe Moore was an old man by the time he got out, and he'd spent 4 years of the few he had left in a cell for nothing. Young Freddie Brookins came home and said the thing that I think is the truest sentence anybody said in this whole affair, that he'd missed seeing his children grow up. You can pardon a man. You cannot give him back the years he was gone, while his babies learned to walk and talk and ride a bike without him. There's no settlement check that buys those back. There's no governor's signature that unmisses them. Marriages had ended. People had lost their health inside. Some came out angry and stayed angry, and who could blame them? Some came out and just wanted to be left alone to be a person again instead of a case. And the town, my town, never really sat down and reckoned with it out loud. There was no great meeting in the square where Tulia stood up and said, "We did this, we the people of this town, we let one man's word be enough," because the people he accused were people we'd already half decided to believe the worst about. That conversation never happened. The pardons let everybody off the hook for having to have it. The records got cleared, and a town's conscience got cleared right along with them a little too easily. And that's where I've landed after all these years, on the hard moral knot of it. The easy version of this story has one villain, and his name is Tom Coleman, and if you just get rid of the bad apple, the barrel's fine. And Coleman was a liar and a racist and a thief, and he belongs at the bottom of this. I won't say one soft word for him. But if Tom Coleman is the whole story, then the rest of us are just his victims too, and that's not true. Tom Coleman couldn't have done a thing to us by himself. He was one man with a story. It took a whole town to make his story come true. It took a sheriff and a prosecutor who chose not to look too hard. It took lawyers who didn't fight. It took jurors, decent men. Men who coached children who decided it was easier to believe 40 of their black neighbors were criminals than to believe one white officer was a liar. It took a paper that ran it like a victory. It took a state that gave the man a medal. And it took everybody else, the great comfortable middle of the town, who heard the number 46 and felt somewhere down low that it was probably about right, that it confirmed something they already quietly believed about who we were down on our end of town. That's the part that didn't get pardoned. The law against single witness convictions, that's real, that's good. That'll stop the exact same trick from working the exact same way. But the thing underneath the trick, the readiness, the leaning forward willingness of a whole community to believe the very worst about certain of its neighbors on almost no evidence at all. No governor signed that away. No court struck it down. It's still in the ground here, the way it's still in the ground in 1,000 towns that never had their morning yet. I'm an old man now. I still live on the same end of town. I've watched the people who came back grow old, too. The ones who lived, and I've buried some of them. And at the funerals, nobody from the comfortable part of Tulia says much about how those 4 lost years got lost. I don't tell this story to keep the town's wound open. I tell it because the easy lesson, the one bad cop system fixed at the end, is a lie that lets everybody sleep. And I think the people who went to prison earned more from us than a good night's sleep. The real lesson is harder, and it's meant for the listener as much as for me. It's that injustice on this scale almost never needs a monster. It needs a liar, sure, to get it started, but to finish it, to make it stick, to send a hog farmer away for 90 years, for that it needs ordinary church-going little league coaching people who trust a badge more than they trust their own eyes, and who would rather convict the neighbor they know than doubt the authority they've been taught to honor. That's not a Tulia problem. That's a people problem. We just happened to be the town where it got photographed. So when somebody tells me Tulia is a story about how the system worked in the end, I say yes. All right, eventually it worked. After journalists and outside lawyers and a young woman fresh out of law school had to come down here and do for us what we would not do for ourselves. After 4 years. After 90-year sentences. After the children grew up without their fathers. If that's the system working, then God help us all when it doesn't. I think the truest thing I can leave you with is the question that one woman asked at the very beginning. The only question that ever needed asking, the one the whole town drove right past on its way to locking us up. 46 dealers in a town this poor. Selling to who? If even one person with any power had stopped and asked that out loud and waited for an honest answer, none of it would have happened. That's all it would have taken. One ordinary question asked in time by somebody the town would listen to. Nobody asked it. And I have spent the rest of my life understanding that the absence of that one question is the whole story. Not the lie the stranger told. The question the town wouldn't ask because it already quietly liked his answer.